Okay, so today we're talking about qualitative methods, which is pretty broad of a category and sort of includes everything that's not quantitative. And by quantitative, I mean like things that have sampling strategies that are probability oriented and like statistical analysis is usually what we associate with quantitative, and qualitative is sort of like everything that's not that. So even when we're doing like historical analysis or theory or sort of like visual or content analysis, that's qualitative. But the particular qualitative analysis that we're going to focus on is interviews and field research. And these involve the researcher making direct contact with the social phenomenon under study or cultural practices, rituals, or research participants. So the researcher is engaging with them either in an interview process or by actually participating in whatever the setting is that the research participants would normally be in. And so for interviewing, there's more pre-study prep, whereas field methods, there's more flexibility in doing that while you're in the field. So just to go over where we are in the research methods, so we're in field research is our primary focus today, and we're going to talk about observations, analysis, and application. And outside of field research, also qualitative interviewing as well. And so, like I sort of talked about, qualitative is much more encompassing of all research. So all research is qualitative at the outset. So when we're reading literature reviews or other people, what they've written, that's qualitative. So a lot of quantitative studies will have literature reviews in the beginning of them, and that's sort of their qualitative component. But qualitative methods in general have a greater richness of meaning, and concepts sort of emerge from doing the qualitative analysis rather than us having a theory and trying to test it, or a hypothesis and trying to test it. Instead, we're doing inductive reasoning where we're going into a space and then having that space define what the concepts, the terms, the theories are for us. So it's a bit more immersive, and qualitative methods range in the spectrum of being the researcher being like fully a participant in the space versus the researcher just observing. And like we've talked about, qualitative and quantitative, like neither is better than the other. They have strengths and weaknesses. And we'll see that qualitative methods can really be helpful in developing theory or exploratory research in spaces that are unknown or not a lot of data is provided. And especially in criminal justice research, like a lot of qualitative methods will be done in spaces where maybe building rapport and with vulnerable communities that are likely not to want to disclose data to like an official government recording agency, but may be more comfortable doing it to an independent researcher who is trying to explore more dynamics and get sort of the respondent's perspective in a more holistic way than just collecting data points on the individual, but instead getting to know the individual in a more holistic way. So as I mentioned, inductive versus deductive reasoning. Deductive is very much on the quantitative side of things. So we have a theory that defines our hypothesis, and then we do an experiment. So there's a lot of setup before the actual observations. Whereas inductive, which is more qualitative, is we're doing the observations, we're developing propositions, and generalizations from our observations and sort of comparing the interactions we had or the interviews we did, and then developing more of a theoretical framework and concepts that we can define. So they work hand in hand because often the qualitative theory that we develop informs quantitative methods that we might use to test that theory. So they work well together, and I'll mention mixed methods at the end, which is combining quantitative and qualitative, but the majority of this lecture we're just going to talk about qualitative. So I found this graph sort of helpful in understanding all the different methods we've sort of been reviewing. So we see that there's sort of a spectrum. Quantitative often has greater control. We're controlling the setting and trying to isolate variables in like a classic experiment. There's more internal validity, and it's sort of more artificial. We're constructing this space, and you'll see social surveys also are higher on this spectrum, although below experiments, because in social surveys, we're defining the questionnaire, we're constructing who to send it to. That wouldn't necessarily happen in the real world. We're constructing something to test something else. Whereas qualitative methods there's less control. We're not defining what the context is. We're just sort of jumping into the space or into interviewing particular respondents that we're interested in. And there's better external validity, and it's more natural setting. And we'll talk about how the researcher's participation might change the setting or might be framing how people interact with them. But in general, it's more natural than experiments and social surveys. And here's a diagram I put together. So if this is qualitative methods, there's field observations, which we'll be talking about in interviews, which we will also be talking about. And then content analysis, anything where we're analyzing like historical archives or visual representations like commercials or film studies falls into this. And then online forums, if you're perusing through online forums and sort of using that as your data to understand dynamics or whatnot, that also falls into qualitative methods. And we're not going to talk a lot about these things, but they are part of the qualitative methods toolbox. But we are going to be talking a lot about field observations and interviews. And so field observations are usually in the form of ethnography, and ethnography really has a high caliber of what it means to do an ethnography. And in your homeworks, I'm going to provide examples of that, but usually a researcher is in a space for 1 to 2 years and is really immersed in the population or the group dynamics or space that they're studying. And then there are more like case studies that are shorter time in nature, but help provide insight as well. And then there's also interviews. So qualitative interviewing can be done one-on-one and can be done via phone or in person. Usually they're face-to-face. And there's structured and semi-structured and then unstructured interviews. And then there are also focus groups, which deal more with dynamics between people and how collectives construct meaning. And so there are natural focus groups of spaces that are already defined as focus groups. So, for example, like an Alcohol Anonymous group, if you were to participate in something like that and get people in that group to sort of talk about something in that space together, that would be a natural group. Or an artificial one would be if you constructed a group for a particular reason. And then something I'll probably talk about next week is the idea of participatory action methods. And this is when sort of the people who are the research participants are also defining the study and saying what they think should be studied. So, topics appropriate for qualitative interviewing versus field research. So, qualitative interviews are especially well suited for exploratory research, and oftentimes they can be the sole way of gathering data in the criminal justice studies. So if you want to understand the perspectives of those who are labeled as deviant, then you would talk to those particular people and try to recruit them for your study. So for example, if you're interested in doing a study on gang members, maybe you would talk to specific gang members in a particular community and try to get their perspective on like why they participate in the gang or whatnot. Or if you're interested in like high-risk youth who aren't necessarily involved in gangs but are trying to or getting recruited and whatnot and involved in like deviant behavior, then you could also do qualitative interviews with them. And a lot of criminologists will do qualitative interviews with like career professionals who are like specialized in a certain crime. So people who are like professional robbers, and they'll try to understand sort of their perspective and how they, the mechanisms by which they do that specific deviant act. And a lot of this work comes from, like, starting this work definitely was Howard Becker. He wrote Outsiders. I'm not sure if you read this in your undergraduate coursework, but it's sort of a super popular study that shifted the gaze of and focus of criminal justice from just looking at sort of official records to looking at what gets labeled as deviant in culture in general. And he did field research with people who were dance musicians and who would get money like on buses and public transportation spaces, and sort of explore the territorialness of it and like how the dynamics between those musicians occurred. And so a lot of his work developed a lot of theory on labeling that we now test in more quantitative methods as criminologists, and also in qualitative methods as well. So that's an example of someone who looked at like a deviant scene in which there was a sort of scene of dance musicians, and that falls more into field research. So there's also the focus group in qualitative interviews, which is a small group of people and is especially useful in learning about group dynamics, which was mentioned. And you can also develop some quantitative components in it as well. And then topics appropriate for field research, which is like more what Howard Becker did in like becoming immersed in this sort of dance music scene, is when conditions or behaviors must be studied in their natural settings. And its key strengths is that it has enhanced validity, and it's really comprehensive in the perspective, so you get the dynamics of the sort of scene or space that you're trying to understand, and sort of the structures within it too. And this is where you can get sort of the physical settings of things. So if there are certain public spaces that are more likely for people to do their dances and musical performances to gain money, right? You can't get that you could get aspects of that in doing qualitative field methods, qualitative interviewing, but you wouldn't be able to see it going on in person and get a more dynamic understanding of it. Okay, so oftentimes access is at the center of qualitative methods. So if you're doing interviewing or if you're doing field participation, you sort of need to determine whether or not you're an insider or an outsider. So are you already immersed in this community, for example? Are you already involved in like a certain community group, then you're sort of an insider. Or if you are aware of a group or organization that you'd like to study but have no connections or personal ties, then you're definitely an outsider. And so in order to like contact an organization that you're interested in, to sort of immerse yourself or to get interview subjects, you need to sort of get sponsored or gain trust from some higher official that will allow you to get into that space. And too often, if you're working within correctional institutions, like I did some qualitative methods in my undergraduate at a day reporting center, and I got access from the executive director of that space, right? So it was like a more official capacity, and because of like how hierarchical that structure was, I was allowed to be in that space just by one person signing off, and I also had to go through an IRB process through that institution as well as at my own institution. Whereas more informal spaces, like maybe community groups that don't have like a super hierarchy, or volunteer groups, or other spaces like that, there might be a different official way that you are allowed in that space. So maybe they have to take a vote on whether or not they want you to do that study in that space. And there's I find that when you're approaching those spaces as a student and wanting to learn rather than a researcher, you might get a different reaction. And your level of transparency on what you're actually doing in your study is going to be dependent on the research questions and how you can or cannot gain access. But there are a lot of IRB rules about like deception and making sure that you're not causing harm to anyone that you're studying. And it's nice to have an informant or a contact in the space, because that can be the person you sort of shadow and follow around. And oftentimes, especially if you're doing qualitative interviewing, it might be helpful to have compensation for people, especially when we're working with vulnerable populations, because their time that they're offering and their insight is definitely valuable, and we should be trying to leverage our resources to reciprocate for the valuable insight they're giving us. So 2 things to think about as you're trying to gain access to spaces, be that through field observations or qualitative interviews, you want to be aware of your own reflexivity and positionality. And so what I mean by this reflexivity is the researcher's awareness of their perspective, including personal biases, versus positionality is how the researcher's own identity and background shape their perceptions of the field of study and how identity may impact data. So they seem a little similar, but they're a little bit different. So reflexivity, which is spelled wrong in this slide, sorry. Reflexivity is more how you sort of rein in your own personal biases and how you address them to sort of be a blank slate when you're in the field or when you're doing interviews. So you want to sort of neutralize yourself or mirror and reflect the interviewees that you're interviewing. And that's why a lot of studies will hire, or a lot of research, a lot of researchers that have experience in that particular space might be better qualified to do that work. So oftentimes you'll have people who were formerly incarcerated who become professors and academics and do research, who do qualitative interviews with people who are incarcerated. They have a better rapport with those people than someone who hasn't experienced that sentiment. So there's this level of rapport or interpersonal trust that develops that someone who didn't have that experience couldn't access, but at the same time, that person who has had that experience could project that onto the space. So it's about recognizing where you fall into the space that you're engaging with and making sure that you're observing it in a way that is neutral, but also recognizing that you do have subjectivity regardless of how much you try to neutralize your perspective, right? And sort of writing that into your analysis as well. And recognizing that there are power dynamics that definitely, especially in qualitative interviewing, depending on how you do it, if it's more structured, depending on what setting it's in, the interviewees can definitely change the way they respond based off of just that, right? And let alone who they're talking to as well. So developing a sense of trust is super important in qualitative interviewing, and that involves really addressing your reflexivity and positionality. And people who are in sort of like the social work field might understand this as well. And like, so for example, when I worked at Rikers, I definitely knew that the men treated me differently as a woman than my male counterparts who were providing services, right? And I know as a woman of color, they treated me differently as well. So it's like recognizing how people perceive you and like how they interact with you is more the positionality sentiment. So it's recognizing that the data that you're getting when you're engaging with a particular population might be different because of you yourself being in the space. And that doesn't mean that your data is necessarily wrong, but that means that you need to look at it from a critical perspective to know and identify if there are differences or sort of really unpack how that shows up in your data. And I'll give you examples in your homework of people who do a really good job at identifying their positionality and really walking through it. One example is Forrest Stewart wrote a qualitative field research book that was called Down, Out, and Under Arrest, and it's about Skid Row. And the people who live there and how they engaged with police and also homeless shelters, which became a big sort of filter into getting arrested and whatnot. And also, like, police very much try to emphasize nonprofit social services to people who are homeless in this space. And so he did a really good job of providing a statement of positionality and really thinking through how he was being interpreted by the space and how the data might have been influenced by him being in that space. And so I'll probably provide that as an example for your homework to read. And so field research involves making direct observations and asking questions of the people around you. And so it can produce both quantitative data and qualitative data depending on how you set it up. And you make conclusions or generalizations based off of your initial observations, and then when you keep going into the field and like you might ask questions that might challenge those observations of the people around you, but oftentimes asking too many questions in the field can be off-putting, so you sort of want to first observe and see how people interact and sort of try to mirror that to get authentic answers to your questions as well. Yeah, okay. So there's various roles of the observer in qualitative methods, especially in field methods. So in field methods, there's sort of a spectrum, right, which I show here. There's the insider versus the outsider. And so field and ethnographic methods usually fall in complete participation. So you're participating in the space either through an informant that you have, or maybe you're already in the space, or maybe there's a setting in which this particular space occurs. So maybe there's a particular public transportation stop which is very populated by dance musicians. So you would go there. Or maybe there's a particular territory for gang research, so you would go there. And so, or it could be like bars that police frequent. The spaces that field research can be are like very broad and wide in range. For example, Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, she was actually worked in both a public defender and a prosecutor clerk role when she was in law school. And so the setting was county courts. And so she wrote this book based off of working there called Crook County, and she was a complete participant because she was employed by them. She was part of their larger hierarchy of the courts and got a perspective of both the defense side and the prosecutor side. So that's a setting in which you can also do field observations as well. And courts are often open to the public, and so that's a simple space that you can be a direct participant in. She was a complete participant because she actually worked in the system. If I were to be an observer, then that would fall more as an outsider, as a complete observer. So if I just showed up to court but had no buy-in or no involvement in who was there, then that's just being a complete observer. And this only occurs in like a very few settings. So this could also occur if you're like a psychologist and you're watching kids interact with toys like behind a screen, right? There's very limited spaces in which complete observer happens in the criminal justice settings because often you need to identify yourself. But there are some spaces like doing court observations where you can't just be a complete observer and write notes, and that's a very common thing to do. And then another thing is police ride-alongs. Often local police are open to having students do ride-alongs with them in which they're just a complete observer and sort of shadow police officers. And then there's also participant as observer. So you would make known that you're doing a research study and you're also participating with the group. So this would be where you have to define buy-in by some leader or have an informant as well. And then this is when you make known your position as a researcher, but you don't participate. So this might only be appropriate in certain spaces. For example, I'm trying to think. Like when I went to go do field research at the Day Reporting Center and like sat in on group therapy, I was just sitting and observing, but they knew that I was there. So my role as a researcher was known, but I wasn't participating in the therapy itself, right? And so this can often influence the response you get because maybe me being there would make participants want to be more vocal or less vocal based off of how comfortable they are with my own positionality and my own identity, right? And so depending on, you're going to fall within the spectrum depending on your question and the setting in which you're trying to look at, and also just access in general. And there are also ethical questions, right? Whether it's ethical to deceive the people that you're studying in order for them to confide in you. And so you have the IRB, and you would have to write in your proposal to do research is whether or not deception should be used and to justify why it should be used. If it's not harmful to your participants, then the IRB may be okay with it. But if it does cause harm to be deceptive, then they may not. So that may also frame access. Is like, if you're fully honest, will you be allowed in that space? Or if you have to be a little deceptive, or not necessarily deceptive, but just say like, oh, I'm a student, and like not really disclose your particular research question, but instead be open to saying like, I don't really know what I'm looking at, I'm just observing, and like if you have any suggestions for what I should be researching, let me know. So there's like a level of naivety you can promote in your research when you're doing field observations that might allow people to disclose more of their own subjectivity to you. I'll leave it here. Okay. And so sampling in both field research and interviewing you're rarely using a probability sampling because these are spaces that you're trying to gain access to. They're more exploratory. They might be with vulnerable populations. And so instead, purposive sampling is common. So you have sort of an idea of the types of individuals you want to look at based off of the constructs that you're developing, or it could just be a convenient sample of whoever's in that setting, right? And so Access might also frame this. So sometimes maybe you just know one person who is in this particular population, and then you do a snowball sampling where you ask that person if they know other people that would qualify in that space. And so, like, for example, I did qualitative interviews for my thesis in undergraduate of what police and people who are formerly incarcerated think of crime theories. So I started with my father, who's a police officer I knew, and then he referred me to people who referred me to other people. And then I also had a colleague who was formerly incarcerated, and I interviewed them, and then they referred me to other people as well. And so there's ways that you can rely on sort of a snowballing of samples to develop and get a larger and more robust sample of interviewees. And sampling in field research tends to be more complicated than doing like qualitative interviews. And depends on the predictability of the phenomenon being observed. So, for example, court observations. I might know that court hearings occur every day from 9 until they're done. So I might systematically sample random days in a particular time period, and that's how I tried to develop a probability sample. Whereas for things that are more fluid, like people busking and dancing at public transportation spaces, or like informal volunteer groups who are like trying to do violence prevention, those things might not be as random, right? When we're working with more like government official spaces, we can try to do some forms of sampling, but when we're not, we can't. And if you can subdivide the characteristics of those spaces, then maybe you can sample in a way that's more purposive. So for example, if there's behaviors and characteristics of the population, like maybe there's a gender divide, but there are different genders in the space, then you could try to make sure that you observe those different spaces. If there are different locations, or if there's so if you're doing ride-alongs with police, maybe you want to do some day sessions and also some night sessions, and divide yourself based off of how police shifts work, right? You want to get a representative sample, so you want to make sure that you get all the shifts of a police, of how police are structured. Otherwise, you're going to not be getting an ideal picture of how policing works. So you need to sort of bear in mind the two stages of sampling. So one, to what extent are the total situations available for observation representative of more general class of phenomena which we wish to describe and explain? So like I talked about with the policing situation, there's a structure that is part of a general phenomenon. and you can describe that. Whereas when you're in the field trying to understand specific situations and whether or not they're representative of a larger thing is a little bit more difficult and fluid. And are actual observations within those total situations representative of all possible observations? So if you can imagine all possible observations, is the observations that you did, are they representative of that larger all observations? And so you need to take into consideration when you're doing field observations the context. So weather, time, space, population, because those might be framing your observations and might, the nice thing about field research is it's flexible, so they might make you adjust the next time you go into the field what you're looking for or how you frame your observations.
Hello.
Okay. And so we're talking about qualitative methods today, and we're talking about sampling and qualitative methods. So when you're doing field observations and also qualitative interviews. And we sort of talked about this before. So a snowball sample is when you sort of have informants and they provide you with people who would also fit the description of the types of people you're wanting to interview. Voluntary responses is if you say you're posting your study in different spaces that might have access to the population you're focused on. So let's say you want to do qualitative interviews with judges, so you find associations for judicial practitioners and post that, and then they voluntarily respond to be interviewed by you. Convenience sample might be if you are interested in how people perceive courts and you go to a court and you just interview the people who are in the courtroom after the court hearing has ended. You catch them outside. And then purposive sampling is sort of what we were talking about before, in that it is it's a sample selected on knowledge that you have prior, or maybe in your preliminary observation. So, for example, I did preliminary observations of parole hearings in a particular jail, and I realized maybe I should do observations geographically in both South Jersey and North Jersey, because there might be differences there. And then maybe I should also do sampling based off of the board members themselves. So maybe I should sample like 10 hearings with these board members together and 10 with these. So it's based off of my understanding of the structure itself. And that can be harder when you're doing, like, these don't necessarily apply to field methods unless maybe in purposive sampling when you're understanding how the structure of the organization that you're interested in, if it's a more formal organization or more informal organization, how their structure exists might be how you develop your sample as well. And remember, these are all non-probability sampling, so the strength of qualitative methods is that we can get rich descriptors and really develop theoretical understandings and concepts, but we can't really say within a certain amount of error whether or not what we are seeing is accurate of the larger population which we're interested in. So qualitative interviews are an interaction between an interviewer and a respondent, and they vary in their formality and in their structure, and they can be thought of as a purposeful conversation. So you're doing a lot of active listening when you're in a qualitative setting, and it allows us to explore more of the dynamics and the hows of maybe quantitative research. So maybe we know that depression leads to increased suicide, but if we do qualitative interviews with people who are depressed and who have ideation of that type, then we can understand sort of the mechanisms by which that happens. So it gets, if we have a causal understanding, it helps us understand the mechanisms and dynamics within it. Or let's say poverty leads to increased crime. So if we interview people who are more at high risk of doing crimes and are in a poverty level and understand like what would incentivize them to do crimes, then that helps us understand dynamics, which we couldn't by just knowing a quantitative level analysis of that increasing poverty increases crime. So there are, and feel free to type in questions if you have any during the lecture. So there, as I was telling you, there's different types of formalities. So there's structured, semi-structured interviews, and then there's unstructured interviews. So we can think of structured interviews as sort of similar to survey methods. So there might be particular questions you have that you want to explore and you would be done in a survey, but instead you want to have more of a conversation around them, then that would be a structured interview. Let me actually go. I think we should cover interview schedules first. So interview schedules, instead, like in survey methods, you usually have a questionnaire that has all the particular questions that respondent has to answer and sort of what the answer responses are, whether or not it's open-ended or closed-ended and whatnot. But in qualitative methods, you have an interview schedule, which is more of an outline of that. So it's not as strict and it's more open-ended. All of it is open-ended. The questions that you're developing are what changes. So your questions might be more structured or less structured. And so you can create categories and nested sets of topics or questions. So in qualitative interviewing, there doesn't necessarily need to be questions necessarily. You could be more open-ended and say, what do you think about this topic, right? It doesn't need to be a particular question, but sometimes it is. And there should be like a good flow between questions, and the order of it should make sense. So you often come in with concepts in mind or things you want to explore or compare, and those are the broader categories, and then you sort of sub-structure it by particular questions within those categories. Hold on. And it's customary to develop like rapport with the person you're interviewing and to not put like super heavy loaded questions in the beginning, questions that are super relevant to the topic you're addressing, but instead to warm up the interview and get at the smaller, less content specific questions first. So structured interviews consist of predetermined questions and answer sets, and sometimes the answers are standardized, so it can be more like a survey. And your answers can sometimes be quantified. but this lacks depth, and especially if you're doing more exploratory work, you're framing the space and content in which the person you're interviewing is allowed to go in. So maybe they wanted to talk about other things relevant to your topic, but you're not able to see that because you're being very formalized and you're the one defining the questions. And semi-structured interviews allow you to explore themes that might emerge that the interviewer might come with them into the interview with. And it allows for unscheduled probes too. So maybe the interviewee said something interesting about a topic or space that you weren't thinking about. You can ask them to expand on that or to define what they mean by that, and you're allowed to sort of go off track in different spaces that you wouldn't be allowed to in a more structured interview. So the semi-structured interview has benefits from the structured interview in that there are spaces in which you can quantify what the interviewer is saying, but you could also be more spontaneous and go off topic from the particular questions that you've developed. And unstructured interviews are exactly how they sound. You might have develop more of a rapport with the person and do sort of like an informal chat. And so you are more framed by how the interviewer is interacting with you than you setting up things for them to engage with. Instead, you provide like very open-ended, broad questions, and your questions are defined by how the interview develops. So you're sort of developing questions on the spot. And then there also might be, even though it's unstructured, you might still have an interviewed guide of just like a broad level of topics that you want to touch on. And so it doesn't need to happen in that order, but you're just sort of looking at your list and making sure, okay, we've covered the topics that I've wanted to touch on, and maybe you didn't cover one of them, so you'll mention it in the interview if it doesn't organically come up. And you'll see that even though these represent like a free-flowing conversation, they do have purpose, especially if you're going in with a particular topics that you're wanting to and you've done like pre-research on it. There might be particular things you're looking for. It's just the way in which the interview is going is you're forming those questions on the fly. And then another form of qualitative methods that we've talked about is the focus group. So this is 6 to 12 people brought together to engage in a group discussion of some topic. And they can generate hypothesis or combine with other types of data, such as participant observations. And this originated in market research in the 1950s. So a lot of how we buy things is defined, like how companies will market their products to us has been framed by group research, and like how people feel towards specific images and whatnot. But it's also widely used by social scientists to gather qualitative data as well. And it's usually moderated by the researcher. And it can show how opinions are produced, expressed, and exchanged within the group dynamic. And it can also be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. And unstructured spaces are often used for research that is more exploratory and to understand a topic or to generate questions. And so there's two types of groups in which focus groups occur. So there's the natural groups. Individuals may already exist or be acquainted in a previous connection, or they may have a shared cultural meaning. And then artificial groups are those where the researcher is the one who's decided who to bring together. So maybe you want a diverse focus group, or maybe you want a focus group in which they all share the same characteristics, but they've never met before. And this is best when you are sort of wanting to reduce the pre-existing relationships that might influence how the group dynamics function, which can occur in more natural groups, right? If people already know each other prior, they may have their own tensions or affinities that may be shaping how the discussion goes. And so in focus groups or in qualitative interviews, you're going to be developing questions prior to your research, sort of similar to how we develop surveys. But the difference is that in surveys, we're providing the questionnaire to the respondent and asking them to fill a form out, whereas in qualitative interviews, we're the ones that are looking at these interview questions, and they're a reference for us to frame the interview and conversation that we're going into with the participants. And so there could be sort of branching that develops, like in questionnaires. There might be questions that are only relevant if people reply in the affirmative towards something or identify with something. And so this can develop into either a tree and branch approach or a river and channel approach. And so a tree and branch approach would be that like one line of questioning does not take precedence over other areas, whereas a river and channel approach involves many streams of questions that lead into a main channel. And so this is more exploratory than the tree and branch approach and allows for a deeper exploration of topics. And so you can also have two other frameworks that frame your questions and whether or not they're diachronic or synchronic. And diachronic means that it starts at the beginning and progresses chronologically. So maybe you're trying to understand how people who are in poverty like get into crime, and so you're starting with, okay, what was your first like deviant experience? Like, when do you feel like you started to want to go into this space more? Whereas synchronic might be that the structure is not so dependent on the element of time. So maybe you're framing things more thematically instead of chronologically. And this is something for you to look over more on your own time, but there's some sort of examples of good and bad questions. And so they're very similar to when we look at survey methods, the types of questions. You want to, when you're interviewing someone, keep the questions simple and open and broad, depending on whether or not you're doing structured, semi-structured, or open-ended interviews or focus groups. And you want to use the appropriate language level, so you don't want to be using like super jargony language unless the specific space you're in uses jargony language. So if you're working with judges, maybe you want to have a vocabulary of how judges speak about particular things, versus if you're working with youth, then you want to meet them where they're at and speak in a way that is accessible to them, but also isn't like condescending where you're like trying to be cool and like be like the youth, right? And you want to have more neutral words when you're asking questions, so you don't want to have emotional words in the questions themselves. And then probes can also occur in semi-structured and unstructured interviews. So you might have heard something interesting that your interviewee said and you want them to expand on it or provide more detail. So you might say something like, can you give me an example of this happening? Or, wait, that's really interesting. Can you tell me more about how you felt in that situation? Or what else was happening when that happened? And it's important to build in prompts if you have quiet respondents. And sometimes your survey schedule might adjust based off of the interviews you have with like your preliminary interviewees or your first couple of interviews. Maybe they're a little bit quieter, so you build in probes throughout the interview schedule. And there's different types of probes, right? So there's attention probe, so like you're showing that you're being attentive and you want them to expand with your body language, not necessarily saying anything. And then there's a continuation probe, so you're gesturing to elaborate, like, oh, that's interesting. And then there's a clarification probe, so maybe you ask them to clarify what they're saying, or you repeat what you think they said and ask if that's correct. And so this is all prep work for doing the focus group and qualitative interviewing, but when you're actually conducting it in real time and you have your semi-structured or whatever prep information for the interviews, when you're actually doing it, you're doing it in maybe a variety of settings. Maybe you're going to a cafe and doing it face-to-face, or you have an office or a particular space, or maybe you're doing phone interviews if your participants live far away, or if you can't get into the space that they're in. And so you develop a rapport with them, recognizing your own reflexivity and positionality and how they may approach you. And you want to be more sort of conversational and to, while you're going through the interview, understand how people are interpreting you. And it's often like you can defer to like, oh, I'm a student, I don't really understand what you mean by that. But you want to be respectful as well. And so people who are extroverts or introverts might have different strengths or weaknesses coming into this. Like you might be really good at listening, or you might be really good at getting people to want to engage with you because you're dynamic. So you sort of need to go into it knowing that as well. And you might need to have like multiple interviews. So maybe the beginning of your interviews were not great and you had to adjust your interview schedule. Then you might need to redo some of the interviews at the beginning. And you want to show you're actively listening. You want to be interactive. And you want to be engaged. And then conducting focus groups. So when you prepare your interview schedule and determine who you want to be interviewed and whether or not you want to have a natural or an artificial group, you have to decide about the physical arrangement of the group. Are you going to sit people in a certain structure? How long are you going to have the interview? And focus groups usually range from 90 minutes to 2 hours. And you really want to be aware of groupthink and dominant group members. So oftentimes people want to be more harmonious and won't necessarily say things if they're going to cause conflict, and they like to reach consensus. And there also might be dominant group members who take over the group and maybe silence other people. So maybe you want to call on people who are a little bit more quiet and ask them their opinions, or like have the focus group break out into smaller groups. So those people might be more likely to say something. And you really need to be aware of stigmatized topics. So if you're talking about things that are more sensitive, maybe you need to set ground rules prior so people feel trusting that like what's being said is not going to be identified to them, and that just everyone agrees to not take things out of the space. But people might be less willing to share if they feel like people may judge them based off of what they say and whatnot. So you really need to assess whether or not a focus group is the right place to talk about more stigmatized topics. And so when you're recording all these observations, interviews, field research, focus groups, sometimes the best way to do that is to do recordings. And this is easier to do when you're doing interviews or focus groups, because you can, oftentimes IRB will allow you to have someone sign a consent form that they're open to being recorded. But then you have to sort of transcribe all of that, and that takes a lot of time. But then you have a lot of rich data. You could also, when you're doing field notes, you can jot down things on a notepad. That's sort of depending on the level of your observation. If you're like a complete outsider and you're observing and people know you're observing, you can sit there and just take notes the entire time, and that's just part of your role as the person who sits there and takes notes, and people will get used to it. Or you can, if you're more immersed in the space, maybe you have to have a small notebook, and when you go to the bathroom, you need to jot down like incidences that will spark your memory for when you go back to your car or your computer, and you can write them all out. And it's important to do that in a way that's like very timely, because we lose memory the longer and longer we let ourselves not just sit and write up what that space was. And then there's often sometimes maybe you'll record what happened in the car after you did the field observations and go through everything that happened based off of chronological order that you remember. And those are your own field notes, is by you doing an auto recording of yourself. So there are a lot of different ways to collect data when you're doing qualitative methods. You could also do videotaping and photographs if people consent to it, which is very important. Yeah, so it's important when you're doing field notes that there's two sort of stages of taking notes when you're in the field and actively participating. Is like there might be sketchy notes, like little signifiers you have to remember particular situations, and then there's the more detailed notes that you rewrite later. And then you might also come into space with structured observations, and I'll give you an example of that later in the lecture. But you might have done preliminary research on the setting and know that there's a structure in which you can sort of check off particular things. Like there was this one study of social disorganization, and people did semi-structured observations of like particular blocks and whether or not they had litter or broken windows or particular things that they had to check off. So that might be an example of structured observations. And this is known as an environmental survey. So the observer records information about the conditions of a specific environment. And so some researchers have also looked into like Google Maps as a space to do that, so they can like use Google Maps to observe the streets in that way as like a particular snapshot in time. Yeah, so you really should log the particular interviews, the times and dates you were in the field, like sort of have like a data summary of like the time and places in which you got the data, like sort of on an Excel sheet, or like the people you interviewed, or the focus group time and what the topic was for that particular session. And you should write promptly after the incidences, because you can really forget things over time. And as a general rule of thumb, you should spend as much time studying the transcript as you did conducting the interview. And there's this process of memoing, so that involves writing about your research process from beginning to end, and it's sort of part of an audit trail or record, because you want to make sure that you have all of your data very much organized and systematized, so if anyone else wants to look at it or do a replication or has questions about how you got to those specific conclusions, you want those as reference. And so there's 3 types of memos. There's operational, coding, and analytic. So operationals, you write about the steps that you took at each stage of the research process. Coding is allow you to document the process of coding the data, and we're going to get into coding in a little bit. And analytic is you provide a way to explore relationships in the data. And so these memos become part of a data log, and each qualitative person develops a different system for doing this, but you should just make sure that it's systematic and that if someone else asks, you can provide them with backup data. And there are like specialized computer applications to help organize this. One of the most popular I know of is In Vivo. I actually haven't used it. And then there's Atlas TI. Okay, so this is an example of a structured observation. There's a lot of court watch programs around the country. There's one in New York, and they provide sort of a tool for people who are volunteers or observers to look at the court and sort of see the dynamics and collect data on courts. And these structured observations are often time and resource intensive because a lot of court hearings go by really quickly. So oftentimes multiple observers are ideal instead of just one. And so I actually did some court observations a year ago in New Jersey's courts, and this is sort of an example of a tool that we use to collect the data. So you see here that we collect the judge's name, the time the hearing started, the city, the date, and sort of the appearance of the defender. A lot of times this happens on video because the people are in the jail, and the charge mentioned. And so there's this sort of checklist that the structure of it goes along with how the structure of the hearing goes. So as the hearing is going, I'm sort of filling out all of these things. And this all happens within like less than 5 minutes. So you need to be trained to do this. And so I did some preliminary observations before and like tested looking for these keywords to determine the binary variables and filled them out myself. And then oftentimes at the bottom here, excuse me, at the bottom here, which is not pictured, is like notes. So if there are particular interactions that I found interesting, I will write that at the bottom for the notes. And so this is an example of when it would be appropriate to do a structured observation, when you're observing something that is structured and that there are particular things that always happen. There's always a prosecutor, there's always a judge, there's always a defendant, and maybe the defense is private or public, so there are sort of things you can check off, and this all can develop into quantitative data. But this isn't for every setting, right? And so data analysis, qualitative data analysis, is much different than quantitative. It can be managed through tables, charts, and other visual displays. And a lot of it has to do with reducing the amount of data. So you have all of these interview transcripts, and you have all these field observations of all these situations that happened. And so you need to sort of sort those into larger themes. And you need to also compare and contrast and see where there's similarities and where there's differences in those themes. So your book provides Laughlin and Laughlin suggests the following units of thinking. And so there's meaning, practices, episodes, encounters, roles, relationships, groups, organizations, settlements, and social worlds. And even in informal or like deviant or criminal spaces, there are going to be relationships and organizations and groups and divisions, and you just need to like look out for those. Okay, and coding is what assigns meaning to these particular data that you're looking at. And so you're coding information from your interviews or field observations, and it creates categories for the variables that you will analyze. So we're doing inductive analysis, so the data itself is what's giving us the variables that we're researching. So maybe there's a particular term that people kept saying that's not in the literature, but is a term that kept coming up in all the interviews. That's going to be a clear coding tool for you to code that into your analysis. And so there's open coding, so it's brainstorming where you explore all possible meanings before you apply conceptual labels to the data. And it begins by chunking small units of data in an exploratory fashion. So you might have that term come up over and over again, and so every time it's used, you sort of aggregate all its usages and then explore what the working definition of it might be by reading through everyone who's sort of talked about it. And then there's also a lot of like, okay, you've coded, now you need to go back into the data and see if anything that is there challenges what you initially coded, or it might be more nuanced or more complex than you initially thought. And so you might look for patterns in the particular codes. And you might want to be organizing your code, so maybe that particular definition or recurring theme was a part of a larger theme that you're looking at. So maybe you want to organize your coding into different spaces itself. So there's themes, are sort of the higher level concepts. And then there are the coding, like the smaller level concepts. And there's sort of 8 techniques for identifying themes. You can find similarities and differences, linguistic connectors. Like I said, maybe there's a term that people keep using that you never heard of, repetitions. So there are phrases that are being repeated, typologies, if there's sort of frames or structures that the interviewee or the people that you're observing frame things in, metaphors and analogies, transitions, missing data, and theory-related materials. So quality and rigor in analyzing qualitative interviewing. So it's important to consider the reliability and validity of data of qualitative interviews. You want to have an audit trail of field notes and memos, and you want to have cases that might negate the ideas that you're having as well. And there are ways that you can institute member checks, so you can actually get your interviewees or participants in your focus group or people that you're doing field observations with, and you can read drafts of the concepts that you're developing, or have them look at how you're interpreting their stories or whatnot, and see if they have any feedback for you on whether or not what you're interpreting is correct. And this can also be pretty helpful, like in participatory action methods. And also, if you oftentimes, like when I did my qualitative interview, I shared my findings with my participants and allowed them to provide feedback or whatnot. There's like different conventions around like whether or not the interviewees are supposed to be participating in the analysis of things. And yeah, it just depends on how hierarchical you are and how open you are to feedback. So there's this up and coming visual criminology, and you'll be allowed to explore this in your homework if you wish to. And it's the idea of using photography as an ethnographic research method in the criminal justice setting, and researchers may be the ones taking the photos. Like, for example, I took this photo of Cook County Department of Corrections, and I thought the contrast was interesting, right, of the graffiti against the actual institution itself, and maybe I could write like an analysis of this visual and apply certain theories to it and whatnot. But then there's also research participants that may take the photos. So there was a study by a scholar from DePaul, and she worked with women who were victims of domestic abuse, and she gave them disposable cameras and told them to sort of take pictures of what it felt like for them and what was important to them. And so they developed those pictures and then sort of talked about them in group. And that was a form of sort of empowerment for them to define like how they were sort of coping in the space and what it meant to be a survivor and victim of domestic abuse, and also allowed for more like tangible visual representations of that. So it increased the quality of the analysis because it provided sort of a way for the participants to engage in the analysis in a way that was visual and more accessible than necessarily writing about their feelings, or it produced findings that maybe couldn't have been developed if there was just an interview or a focus group. It added another element of analysis that created more robust findings. So, we're winding down. The qualitative interviews, strengths and weaknesses. So they definitely can get a lot of depth and richness depending on how you do them. They have a lot of flexibility. Like I said, you can change your interview schedule if you find that your interviews aren't going well the first round. You can definitely study active offenders in field settings, and you can't do that necessarily with quantitative methods. And you can incorporate your participants' perspectives into your analysis as well. Some weaknesses is that you can't make generalizations about a larger population, right? You can make it about the population you're studying, or like often people said this, generally people said this, but it's hard to make some quantitative generalizations about the entire population because it's not a probability sample, right? There's also some low reliability, so it could be interpreted differently based off of the researcher who's doing it. But there's some high validity, right? Observational studies have the potential to yield measures that are more valid than quantitative measures, right? And this is often very true in field research because the intended meaning is more context specific and can be more specific in general. And the things observed or the people interviewed can be more accurately captured. So compared to surveys, field research methods generally have more validity but less reliability. And qualitative interviewing, if you're doing it well, it can retain richness and recognize meanings and shared meanings, but it can be constrained by the interviewer depending on how structured your interview is going, and the reliability is a bit low as well. And you can have more generalizability depending on how you do your sampling compared to field observations, because maybe you're trying to develop more of a purposive sample, but it does still have issues with generalizability. And then there's also, which we'll get into in the final week more so, is mixed methods. So it's bringing these qualitative methods that we just learned about in with quantitative methods. And this allows for more triangulation of the data and the use of official records and historical context or surveys with more field research and qualitative analysis as well. And that's all I have for lecture today, unless you all have any questions. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.